Good afternoon, everyone, and we're glad to have you here. This is the Medical Cannabis Commission, our third or fourth meeting, I think. Third or fourth meeting, I can't remember. We're glad to have you here. We're going to focus today on hearing from our law enforcement professionals and the Pharmacy Association as well, too. But to all the members of the committee, thank you for being here. Let me just get a couple of house cleaning notices out for you. It looks like this will be our probably our next to last meeting. We will be looking at having our final hearing tentatively scheduled for December 1st. I think I sent you a note about that, and it will probably be an all-day gathering, testimony in the morning, and then break for lunch, and then have some conversation about where we are and what kind of recommendation we want to make to the governor that afternoon. So if you can kind of block your calendars, that's kind of what we're looking at. We're trying to minimize the amount of time you're taking away from your job and your careers. I know most of you are giving up money to be here from your day job, and so we're grateful to have you here. Let me just remind everyone real quick of the purpose of this commission. As detailed in HB 1, signed by the governor on April 16th, Haley's HOPE Act, to establish a comprehensive recommendation regarding the potential regulation of medical cannabis in this state, and to provide a detailed report which shall be submitted no later than December 31st, 2015. That is our charge. That is what we're committed to doing on this very important matter that means a lot to a lot of people in our state. So, that being said, we'll get started. Unless there's other comments from any other members of house cleaning that we need to address. Let me just introduce everyone real quick for those that are here. Brian Rickman, who's district attorney from the Mountain Judicial Circuit from Haversham. Dr. Cynthia Wetmore is not here. She will be here shortly. Dr. Young Park, who's a neurologist at Georgia Regents University, will not be here today as well. Dr. Mark Murphy, gastroenterologist, will not be here today. Dr. Mandy Reese, who's a pharmacist from Gainesville and vice chair of the Department of Pharmacy, is here as well. Dr. Reese down there. Chief Stacy Cotton is not here. Had a national meeting. Had to attend. Sheriff Gary Goolidge from Paulding County is here. Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald may be coming in a little later. Commissioner of Public Health. Dr. Vernon Keenan, our GBI director, is here as well, too. Rick Allen, director of Georgia Drugs and Narcotics Agency. James Sutton is here, subbing for Gary Black. James is the director of operations for the Department of Agriculture. Dr. Alice House, who's chairman of the Georgia Medical Composite Board, is here. Ryan Teague, who's Governor Deal's executive counsel. And then Representative Katie Dempsey from the Rome area, and Senator Butch Miller as well from the Gainesville area, and Senator Renee Underman will be here with us shortly. And I'm Alan Peake, representative from the Macon area. Glad to have you here. We will have testimony today just from invited guests. We have had several people who have contacted us and said they would like to provide testimony. We are, for this commission, only having testimony from invited guests. If you do have or have an interest in providing some testimony in some form or fashion, you are welcome to do that by emailing me. You can find my email address on the Georgia General Assembly website, and we will make sure that gets distributed to all of the commission members and into the records as well, too. So, okay, let's get started. We've got several folks today here. One individual who's traveled from a long way, Dr. Barry Logan, who is Vice President of Forensic Science with NMS Labs, who is recommended by the Prosecuting Attorney's Council, who is going to testify. Chuck Spahos, who is the Executive Director for Prosecuting Attorney's Council, you want to introduce him and come make a statement as well, too? There we go.
Just quickly, Mr. Chairman, we appreciate your time. I've also got Joe Stone with me, who's the Traffic Resource Prosecutor for the state. We've asked Dr. Logan to come, and I'm going to let him introduce himself, but just to kind of say what we're laying the foundation about is just some concerns about the practical application that law enforcement and prosecution has to deal with as more marijuana becomes available legitimately or not, and some of the problems that we deal with practically. So I'm going to yield my time to Dr. Logan, and again, we can come back later and talk about any kind of.
Okay, you're welcome to stay sitting right there through the presentation if you'd like. Just be your choice. Glad to have you here. Joe Stone. Okay, good. Glad to have you here. Dr. Logan, we'll turn it over to you. And if you'll speak into that microphone, make sure so all the 13 people watching on the internet can watch it and hear you as well, too. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I appreciate the opportunity and the invitation to be here to talk to you today. I'm a forensic toxicologist. I've been in this practice for about 30 years, doing research in forensic toxicology. The effects particularly of drugs and driving has been an area that I've researched and published on. A wide variety of drugs, prescription medications, as well as illicit and recreational drugs. And I'm really here to talk to you today about a specific issue related to marijuana and what I consider to be its most significant adverse effect, which is some of the psychomotor and impairing effects that it has on driving. And I think that all jurisdictions that are looking at increasing access to the use of cannabis, whether for medical or recreational purposes, are going to have to take account of this when they put structures in place to protect the citizens of their jurisdiction with respect to their safety on the highway. I have some material prepared. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them as you go along. If you think I'm getting into areas that aren't really germane to your remit, then please let me know. And
okay, we'll do. We may have some questions for you, and I'll remind members of the committee, if you do have a question, just press your button, and we'll recognize you at that point.
Thank you.
So go ahead.
So I'm certainly conscious of the fact that this is a medical marijuana initiative in the state of Georgia. I did do some review just to convince myself or satisfy myself that the kinds of doses that we're talking about for medical applications certainly have some significant overlap with the kinds of doses that individuals who are using marijuana recreationally are going to be taking. And so there's some significant interaction or side effect, if you like, of people who are using products containing THC with the kind of effects that are likely to impair or impact their driving. The actual amounts of THC that people ingest for medical purposes is really a function of the condition they're taking it for. When people use marijuana recreationally, they certainly titrate their dose. They puff on a cigarette until they get to a level where they're comfortable, they're feeling the euphoria or general relaxation effects they're looking for. And likewise, when people are taking cannabis products for medical purposes, if it's for the treatment of pain, they'll take the dose until they reach a point where their pain is abated. Or if they're taking it for control of seizures, then they're going to increase the dose to the point where the seizures become abated. So irrespective really of what the concentration of THC in a particular product is, just keep in mind it's really the dose or how much of that product is ingested that's going to dictate its ultimate impact. You can kind of think of it like you can get just as drunk on 4.2% beer as you can on 80 proof liquor. You just have to drink more of it. So I was asked very briefly to talk about cannabis effects. It certainly is a drug that's been in folk pharmacopoeia for almost 4,000 years, from ancient Chinese literature up to applications in modern medicine and modern folk medicine. Marijuana is a complex substance. It does contain over 500 different chemicals, about 100 of which are cannabinoids, the major one being THC. That's the active component in the plant. Has a variety of other related compounds. Cannabidiol is the one that has gotten probably the second most greatest attention, which has been invoked as having significant properties in abating seizures. And the combination of THC and cannabidiol are also, I think there is medical evidence to support its efficacy in the treatment, particularly of neuropathic pain. I think there are many other conditions that are invoked in terms of candidates for medical marijuana, but I think really public sentiment, in my personal opinion, is a little ahead of the science in terms of its efficacy. The way in which the cannabinoids work is that they interact with receptors or proteins in the brain, and the cannabinoid receptors are distributed throughout the brain, but they're particularly prevalent in areas of the brain that control movement, cognitive functioning, the hypothalamus, which controls appetite, the hippocampus, which controls or governs learning and memory, the spinal cord, which is a conduit for a sensation of pain. So anywhere that the cannabinoids in marijuana are going to bind are going to have impacts on those areas of the brain and the functions that they're responsible for. So We know that marijuana can be used to increase appetite. That's one of the things that's advocated in terms of its use in cancer patients. But the side effect is its impact on movement, on higher cognitive functioning. These are things that really are the focus of my concern with respect to impact on driving. When somebody ingests a cannabinoid product, they'll experience some physiological effects. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, the capillaries in the white part of the eye open up, so eyes can appear bloodshot. People experience dry mouth, increased appetite, and so on. These are, in fact, some of the signs and symptoms that law enforcement officers use when they're interacting with motorists they suspect to be under the influence of something as part of their investigation that may ultimately proceed to an arrest or a drug test. The psychoactive effects, the reasons why people use the drug recreationally and the effects that people may experience when they take the drug medicinally include euphoria, relaxation, reduction in stress. People report enhanced perception, particularly of music or humor or the arts. It's alleged to increase individuals' creativity, improve abstract thinking, and in some individuals will produce illusions, pseudo-hallucinations. And at the bottom of the list, I think, in rare conditions, in susceptible individuals, anxiety, paranoia illusions, and depersonalization. So more serious psychic side effects, somewhat related to the individual's expectation of effect and the setting in which they're using the drug. So a range of psychoactive effects. With respect to driving, the cognitive and psychomotor effects are the ones that get the bulk of the attention of law enforcement and the courts. The drug does have effects on an individual's ability to concentrate on a task, particularly tasks that require sustained attention or vigilance. And driving is probably the best example of that. It's a fairly monotonous task that you have to pay attention to for a long period of time, lots of components of it in terms of proper conduct and safe conduct of the vehicle. So some of the sedative effects of cannabinoids can lead to fatigue and sleepiness. It does cause a slowing down of reaction time. It requires more effort for problem solving and also causes some issues with respect to registering, processing, and using information. Not so much with sensory effects, but with perceptual effects. And so that ultimately translates with respect to a person's driving. If you have problems with an individual's ability to pay attention, to be vigilant to the driving task, to be able to raise their level of arousal from maybe driving that doesn't require that much engagement or effort to circumstances where suddenly there's other vehicles, people are changing lanes, you're trying to maneuver to get off an off-ramp on a freeway, it's dusk, you're in a part of town you don't recognize. When the driving task becomes more complex, the even minor effects of drugs or alcohol start to become a lot more important in terms of an individual's ability to drive safely. There's a large body of information gained from laboratory settings and experiments about how THC impacts the various aspects of driving. And in the interest of time, I won't go through them all. I'm happy to provide copies of any of the articles that I refer to in my presentation. The second aspect I wanted to talk about was how the drug gets into the body and how it gets out of the body, particularly with respect to time course, because that's very excuse me. That's very I have
got some water for you if you need it.
I'm good. That's very important with respect to the effects an individual is experiencing, as well as your ability to detect the substances, the cannabinoids, in a person's blood.
You can take a minute if you need to.
Thank you.
You may have heard him up too much.
That's right, exactly. That means it's time to shut up. No, I'm just kidding. You take your time, get comfortable.
My understanding of the proposal in Georgia is for the use of marijuana oil or THC oil for the particular applications that you have in mind. Marijuana does come in a variety of different forms, in plant material, botanical material, in a compressed form of plant material, of hashish, and then concentrates like oil and other versions of that, such as glass and shatter, which are very high THC content products. Some of these products that are produced for recreational use have upwards of 90% THC in them, but certainly the products can be manufactured to have targeted levels of THC and CBD in them. Route of administration, smoking certainly is the one that's been studied the best. And some of the information I'll share with you today is derived from smoking studies. Oh, thank you. That's very helpful, thank you.
Okay, take time.
Putting the oil products into vaporizing devices, things like a device called a volcano, which is a heating element that vaporizes THC for inhalation, but also into some of the more common vaping devices or electronic smoking devices that you're probably familiar with. When taken orally, it can either be taken in capsules, kind of like cod liver oil capsules, put in capsules and ingested, or it can be put in syringes and delivered into the back of the mouth for ease of swallowing. It can also be baked into baked goods, candy, milkshakes, etc., etc. What we know from studies involving smoking is that the drug, individuals titrate their effect. So if you puff on the cigarette, like I mentioned earlier, you get to the level you're interested in. Each of these little arrows indicates a puff on a marijuana cigarette. And you can see that as soon as the person stops smoking, the drug is very rapidly leaving their blood. This is a concentration of the drug in the person's blood. And that's because the drug is being broken down to some extent, but it's also being absorbed by tissues in the body, particularly the brain. Brain's quite a fatty organ and very readily absorbs the THC. So one of the things I'll emphasize in my closing remarks is just how quickly THC concentrations change in the blood of individuals after they stop administering the drug. This would be true whether this is being smoked in a plant material, whether it's being inhaled through a vaporizer. The concentrations that individuals achieve through smoking or vaping depends on a variety of things. One of the major ones is smoking technique. If you puff on a cigarette, marijuana cigarette, and don't inhale very deeply, and then just exhale the smoke, you'll get much less THC than if you inhale it deep into your lungs, hold your breath, gives the THC the opportunity to absorb. So what the lines on this graph represent just is 6 individuals smoking the same amount of marijuana. You can see that the peaks that they achieve are very different depending on how they ingested it. So even though they're given the same dose, they end up with different amounts in their system. The effect, this is the user's perception of the effect they're experiencing. For smoked marijuana, typically lasts about 2 to 4 hours in terms of observed effects on the skills necessary for safe driving. One of the major considerations with respect to oral cannabis is that the kinetics are very different. So the blue line on the left represents somebody puffing on a cigarette. The level reaches its peak about the time they stop smoking and then starts to decline quite rapidly. The other lines represent the experience of somebody who's ingesting THC orally. The drug gets into the stomach, it takes longer to be absorbed, it goes to the liver, it's released more slowly from the liver over time. So you get a much longer, flatter curve in terms of its effect. The peak effect is not as intense, but if individuals ingested enough of the substance, that effect will become more pronounced over time, and it takes a lot longer for the effects to dissipate.
Dr. Logan, would that apply to oral administration of cannabis oil as well?
Yes, yes. Anything that is absorbed and goes into the stomach and gets into the body that way, okay. Yes. I talked about the specific driving skills that can be impacted by cannabis. One of the things that I've really wanted to leave you with today is the message that from a toxicology point of view, I know that we, when we're thinking about traffic safety and substance use or abuse, alcohol is very frequently the model that we look to because we have a relatively successful model in terms of legislating a per se level and educating the public about what it means to get to that level, how much alcohol you consume. And we have a wealth of scientific literature that supports a 0.08 and the evidence of impairment in practically every person who's consuming alcohol and driving. So we don't have that body of literature to support a level in the blood for THC for a couple of reasons. One is the studies just haven't been done. THC has been a Schedule I controlled substance, and there's been limited opportunities for researchers to conduct these studies. But the second factor is that when we are in the field, when law enforcement's in the field, investigating suspected impaired driving cases, talking to a suspect in a car, getting them out of the car, having them do field sobriety tests, placing them under arrest, transporting them, frequently doing further evaluations using the DRE program, then maybe transporting them to the hospital to get a blood draw. The THC level that's in the blood at the time the sample is collected is very, very different from the amount of THC that was in there when they were actually driving and were first observed by the officer. And that's kind of illustrated in this graph here. Just because of how quickly the drug dissipates, somebody could be smoking in their residence. They stop smoking, their level's already declining, but they get in their car. They're involved in an incident, or they're observed by law enforcement having problems with driving. They're investigated, placed under arrest. By the time the process is complete, over at the right-hand side of the slide, the levels that you're measuring in the blood at the time that the test sample is taken is in no way reflective of the level of THC at the time of driving. And studies in in Colorado and in Washington State have indicated that it's typically 1 to 2 hours between the time when first contact is made and when a blood sample is taken for submission to the crime laboratory for testing. So, in trying to, if we're of a mind to pick a level that's designed to indicate when a person is impaired or under the influence, we just don't, with our current technology of collecting blood and sending it to the lab, have an ability to tell what somebody's level is at the time they're driving. There are a number of states that have legislated levels in their statutes. Pennsylvania has a level of 1 nanogram per mil in its statute. Ohio and Nevada have chosen a level of 2 nanograms per mil, and Washington, Colorado, and Montana selected 5 nanograms per mil for their per se laws. What we found in a sample of 5,000 marijuana DUI arrests that we evaluated was that if you pick a level of 1 nanogram, approximately 90% of people who've been stopped, evaluated, placed under arrest, had a sample taken and submitted to the lab are above the 1 nanogram per mil threshold. If you adopt a level like Washington, Colorado, and Montana have done of 5 nanograms per mil, then half of those people who were stopped, placed under arrest, have THC levels less than 5 nanograms per mil. So if you set the level too high, which would, in my opinion would be 5 nanograms per mil, you're automatically going to lose half of the people who there was probable cause for their stop and arrest. They're not going to be above your per se level. And I think that sends a confusing message to the public. If you're saying the per se level is 5 nanograms per mil, but at the same time you're trying to explain that people can still be impaired enough to be arrested at levels less than that. There's also good evidence that individuals who are combining alcohol and marijuana use are a lot more impaired than individuals taking either one of those substances on its own. So in our case example, with approximately 10,000 marijuana cases, somewhere around 70% of the drivers would have levels less than the 5 nanogram per mil threshold. So there are some pros and cons to trying to set something like that in the law. Certainly, as with alcohol, it's a way to send a message that alcohol impairs, marijuana can impair. It's a way to raise public awareness of that. It certainly creates a black and white standard. Above or below a particular threshold is quite attractive in terms of disposition. It certainly is a useful tool in cases where an individual causes a crash and because of injuries is sustained to themselves are unable to be assessed or put through field sobriety tests or evaluated. Then per se laws are frequently used to prosecute those cases. It also provides for some leverage and opportunities for plea bargaining when the cases go forward for litigation. I think the cons of having a per se level, one of course is that based on what I've just described, the policy, they're really based on policy or desire to have a public policy rather than on a scientific basis for an impairment threshold. But once you set that number, it kind of has an aura of scientific authority, which it doesn't really warrant. So it's not an impairment standard, it's an administrative standard. The other consideration is that somebody who's a responsible marijuana user, how would they be expected to know before they make a decision as to whether to drive if their level is 1 or 2 or 5? There's just no way for somebody to make that kind of assessment, even if they were conscious of their obligations and were trying to comply with the law. So ultimately, setting a high concentration, I think, renders the law useless because so many people who are impaired end up being under the threshold. And at the same time, if you set the level too low, you do run into cases of people who have more historical cannabis use, who in fact are not impaired at the time of driving. And also you run into issues where under extreme circumstances people could be exposed to second-hand smoke or side stream smoke from other people who are smoking marijuana and test positive at these very low thresholds. So I mean, my message and my position on this is that I'm supportive of an impairment standard for jurisdictions that have increased access to cannabis products, where the state's obligation should be to demonstrate impairment through the tools that are currently used in traffic investigations of appearance, demeanor, statements, performance and field sobriety tests, use of the DRE program. Georgia has a strong DRE program, which has been adopted nationally and is very effective in collecting comprehensive information about impairment, and then using a chemical test simply as corroboration of the officer's opinion that the person was impaired, rather than trying to infer impairment from an abstract number. So just to close out, there are a number of jurisdictions that have gone forward with recommendations or guidance for prescribing medical cannabis. In Canada, there are some prescribing recommendations that recognize that cannabis users should be advised not to drive for at least 3 to 4 hours after smoking, for at least 6 hours after oral ingestion, and for at least 8 hours if the experience is subjective high. Recognizing what I said earlier, that the laboratory studies and experimental evidence support that window for impairment following smoked or oral ingestion. In Germany, where there are pilot medical cannabis projects, their overall summary of the risks associated with medical cannabis use was that they were relatively low. The one thing that they singled out was the fact that cannabinoids impede cognitive and psychomotor performance, resulting in impaired driving ability. And even advocates for recreational marijuana use, like the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, has identified as one of their 5 principles of responsible cannabis use, no driving. And specifically, they say the responsible cannabis consumer does not operate a motor vehicle or other dangerous machinery while impaired by cannabis, nor, like other responsible citizens, while impaired by any other substance or condition, including some medicines and fatigue. Of course, one metric of what the impact of this is on public safety would be to look at jurisdictions' crash rates or arrest rates relative to marijuana use in drivers before medical marijuana is introduced and then after the law goes into effect. This really hasn't been done that effectively. We haven't been proactive in measuring baseline levels for these to see how they change after the laws change. There's one study, the Salmonson-Sotel paper, which came out in 2014, that did look at rates of cannabis positivity in fatally injured drivers in the state of Colorado. They also evaluated positivity for alcohol during the same period of time to see if any changes were an impact of rates of testing, for example. And they compared rates of marijuana involvement in fatal crashes between Colorado and other NMMS states. These are non-medical marijuana states, to see if Colorado and the other states were different. So for both Colorado and the non-medical marijuana states, no significant changes were seen in the proportion of drivers in fatal motor vehicle crashes who were alcohol impaired. However, when the medical marijuana law went into effect in Colorado in 2009 and the product became commercially available, the trend did become positive for greater positivity in fatal crashes, and that's what's represented in this figure from that study. The top jagged line represents positivity for THC, and the bottom, which you can see started to increase quite steeply after 2009. The lower line represents positivity rates for alcohol during the same period of time. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to share that with you and my concerns with you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, Dr. Logan. Don't have any questions right now. Any members of the committee have a question directly for Dr. Logan? And if not, well, Mr. Spahos, did you have some other comments? Hang on. Let's see. Dr. Allen, or is that Dr. House? Oh, Andy Reese, sorry. Okay, Dr. Reese, sorry. Yep, got it.
My question is back to the COMB 2015 study talking about the oral cannabis smokers versus the brownie. I guess my question is, was that brownie, what was the dose in that study on the brownie, and was that recreational use or true medical use, looking at the pharmacokinetics?
They gave 3 doses, one at 10 milligrams of THC, one at 25 milligrams of THC, and one at 50 milligrams of THC. And they were baked into a brownie and ingested.
Okay, and was there any difference? Because the one graph just showed all 3 doses with the pharmacokinetics for that. Was there a difference in the pharmacokinetics between the 3 doses?
Certainly, there would be a difference in the area under the curve, but not in terms of the general time course for the observed effects or the experienced effects.
Okay, and then my other question is, for the last study you referenced in 2014 with the trends of fatal motor vehicle crashes, was there, and I don't know if this would be possible in the study to really track this, while the, my thought would be, just the theory that folks who were using it recreationally would probably be a little more willing to use it recreationally, even though it was illegal in 2009 in that study. But you saw the increase in motor vehicle crashes, and my question is, how much of that was truly due to medical cannabis, and how much of that was due to recreational? I guess that's the question I have. Yeah. Would people be more willing to, and to say, oh, but I was using it medically?
That makes a suggestion. Could you put the graphs up while you were explaining these?
Oh, sure.
I think it'd be helpful.
I think this is the graph you're asking about.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what that reflects is not, that is the proportion of marijuana positive cases rather than a frank increase in fatalities.
Okay.
So simply the fact that more of the people who were dying in crashes were positive for marijuana. So it doesn't necessarily reflect more people dying, it just reflects the fact that more of the people who do die were positive for marijuana. And the study was not, or did not, try to distinguish between people who were using recreationally and medicinally.
Okay.
Dr. Reese, I think studies have shown that during that time from 2009 on, statewide fatalities actually decreased in Colorado.
Okay.
Marijuana-related fatalities, however, did increase.
Okay, and I guess another question, I guess we won't know this, the study probably won't be done for a little bit, but since it's been approved for recreational use in Colorado, has there been even more of an increase now that that's, which I don't think there has been. So I just have questions about that study design and that type of thing. And I think we have to be careful. I'm always cautious with studies, the cause and effect. So I just would advise caution, very apprehensive in saying cause and effect. So
I think that's a fair question, and just a reminder to the commission members and those in attendance that at least under Georgia law, smoking is not allowed now, and or vaping, or only ingestion is by cannabis oil, and it is only for medicinal purposes as well too. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Any other, Dr. Reese, at all? You're good. Any other questions for Dr. Logan? If not, Ms. Spejos and Ms. Stone, y'all got a couple comments?
We'll certainly fall back into the schedule if need be. I think part of our point here today was to just say this is different than what we have typically dealt with alcohol and other, and as we make it more available, these are the issues that we will face. Detection on the side of the road, dealing with traffic fatalities and what have you, they're just different, and we ask you to take that into consideration as we make it more available, regardless of how individuals get it.
Absolutely. I got a couple questions.
Sure.
Help me, and I should know this, but what is there a Georgia threshold now for?
No.
So there's none whatsoever. And is there? And the only way to be able to test for under the influence of drugs or marijuana would be through a blood test. Is that correct? Yes,
sir. That makes a huge distinction, whereas everybody's used to the concepts of a roadside
breathalyzer, right?
Breathalyzer test. There's no such device, nor do we see one in the immediate future for dealing with marijuana.
I thought I had seen that there was one under consideration somewhere, but you're not familiar with it?
Well be, but I do not know of one that's in service here.
Draeger makes a roadside that they're testing now in several areas to see about the possibility of its efficiency.
Okay.
That's an oral fluid test. Yes.
I think part of the problem you're going to see, even once that device becomes available, is some of what the doctor has discussed is still the problem. It may indicate a presence of marijuana at the scene. It doesn't change the fact that it still may be another hour or two before the blood could be taken. Mm-hmm. And by the time the blood is actually taken, which would be what would be admissible in court, the marijuana has dissipated.
Right. Have you seen any indication so far since the Georgia's law has been in place that of an increase in driving under the influence of? Have you seen any?
We have no data since July to say one way or the other. No, sir, not since that took effect.
Any anecdotal evidence? And I said of Mr. Rickman as well too.
Well, I mean, I'm hearing from law enforcement about this, about the availability of liquid marijuana and oil and what have you, that they're seeing more and more of that, and edibles that are being introduced. But that's, again, anecdotal. It's too early to say.
Yeah, and again, edibles are not permitted under Georgia law, so, I mean, that would be an automatic
It's just
disqualification.
It's becoming the new way to consume it and have it because of the availability of other products.
Okay. Any members, let's see, Mr. Rickman, or should I call you Judge Rickman, possibly, maybe he's saying so maybe.
Just to chime in real briefly, Chuck, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but to give everybody a little bit of background, when I was a very young prosecutor, Georgia used to have a standard that you could be convicted of DUI marijuana with any amount of THC, and the Georgia Supreme Court struck that down maybe early 2000s.
It's been quite some time now to prosecute an individual for driving under the influence of marijuana. We also have to prove that substance was present to the level that it impaired the ability to drive. That's correct.
But there's no quantitative number to determine that.
No quantitative number. So the enforcement problem we run into is, as Dr. Logan pointed out, I think he did a great job of kind of trying to show the fairness of both sides. You would have some individuals who could be convicted with any amount of THC in their system, which is not a great measure. I mean, it's just not a great measure to know at that moment if they're under the influence. The problem that you see for us is, for example, I think scientifically, I would echo what Dr. Logan said. The best way to know if somebody's impaired is to observe them do a walk and turn, hear them talk. What you have to understand, what we face is, as soon as the standard is, okay, well, manifestations are what get you convicted, then the internet and social media and the defense bar, what's going to be is, don't you dare take the test. And in Georgia, you have a right to refuse. So you get to a situation where, and I'm not saying there's a good answer, pull a car over for weaving, a car gets handed out the window, I refuse to take any tests, if you want to arrest me, arrest me. And so you're not going to be able to meaningfully tell if that individual is impaired, if that makes sense. And I don't know that that's certainly a recurring problem. It's much different than alcohol, where you're going to smell the alcohol more readily, and so.
Yeah. Mr. Spejos, I can assure you, and I think this will be the intent of any legislation we put forward, we realize that there's a challenge for DAs in the state and for law enforcement to make sure that folks that are significantly impaired and provide a risk to other people are kept off the roads.
Yes, sir.
And balance that with having access to medical cannabis that really does help Georgia citizens who have debilitating illnesses who may never get in a car and drive. And so help us come to a solution that works and meets that balance so that we can provide a solution for Georgia citizens, but also protect those who are on the road. So I look forward to working with
Yes,
you.
sir. I think we've shown in our workings with HB1 that we're willing to do that.
You have, and look forward to continuing doing that, sir. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our next presenter, Sheriff Steve Wilson from Walker County, and Terry Norris, Executive Director of the Georgia Sheriff's Association. If y'all will,
We're here, sir.
I'm assuming you do not have a.
No, sir.
You want to just sit down and visit with us? That'd be best.
Yes, sir. We'd love to just sit here a moment.
That'd be great.
We'll be proud
And-
that I did not pull together a PowerPoint.
Well, we're glad to have you here. And Sheriff Wilson, my understanding is you are the new chair of the Georgia Sheriff's Association. Is that correct?
President of the
President of the Sheriff's
President of the
Association.
Sheriff's Association
Good.
From last of July on.
Right. Well, let me just, before you get started, thank you for all the work that 159 counties our sheriffs do and provide public safety for our citizens. We're grateful for that. I know you guys have officers that put your life on the line every day. So
Thank you,
we're and you don't get told enough, but we appreciate what you do. So glad to have you here and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll allow me to begin, for
If you'll grab that microphone,
the
Mr. Norris.
benefit of the commission, I'm Terry Norris. I'm Executive Director of the Georgia Sheriff's Association. As Chairman Peake just said, this is Steve Wilson. He's the Walker County Sheriff. He's been in the field of law enforcement for nearly 35 years or so. He's our current president of the Sheriff's Association and a former drug unit commander. So he has a great deal of experience in that area. Really, our intent to be here today is to, and Steve will do this, is to talk just a little bit about the very finite position at this point in time the sheriffs have taken on the matter of cannabis and marijuana in general. But I wanted to kind of lead off by saying this. This is a very important discussion. The sheriffs realize that. The group you have here, this commission, is intended, as we understand it, to discuss the issues of medical cannabis and maybe even more in the marijuana area, and to come forward with some recommendation for the General Assembly. And you do have yourself and several other members of the General Assembly on the panel, on the commission, and it is clear to us that you all in the General Assembly are the policymakers. And this group is a very important group to vet out the issues related to these matters and to make a recommendation to the General Assembly. At the same time, those of you that walk the halls of the General Assembly, or the Capitol I should say, know that from time to time the sheriffs take a position on a matter of two. And we did take a position last year on HB1. We took a pretty firm position, but as you and I talked many times, it was just that. It was the opinion on of the sheriffs on how the state should proceed in terms of medical cannabis. We did not, in the end, agree with the legislation that was passed and is now law. However, you all were very respectful by allowing us that position. So I say all that to lead into Sheriff Wilson's brief testimony about our current position, which was, I guess, reinstated or reviewed and readopted this past October. So, Sheriff Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, I'll be very brief. 5 points here that I'd just like to bring to your attention. These are points that the Sheriff's Association has taken as a body concerning marijuana and medical cannabis. Number one, we oppose the legislation of marijuana for all social, recreational, and industrial purposes. Number two, we oppose the cultivation of marijuana for all purposes. Number 3, we do support the use of chemicals derived from cannabis for medical use for certain well-defined serious health conditions. Number 4, we do oppose the medical delivery or application of chemicals derived from cannabis plants through smoking. And lastly, number 5, we oppose legislative proposals where appropriate controls and security measures do not exist and where strict civil and criminal penalties are absent.
All righty. Thank you for that, Sheriff Wilson. We may have some questions from the committee. I'll start it off, and we'll say we're grateful for the input of our sheriffs on this, because we want to make sure your job is not more difficult by any legislation we pass. Sometimes we know that happens, but if it is the public policy of this state, the General Assembly and the governor, to adopt a in-state cultivation model for medical cannabis, do you have recommendations for us that would make your job easier, or that would provide you better tools to make sure you're getting the bad guys and protecting those that are performing a business enterprise that's allowed under state law?
Well, again, we do oppose all cultivation. However, if the General Assembly and the governor enacted it into law, certainly we would abide by those laws. We have discussed on several occasions different scenarios that could possibly happen if cultivation were considered and enacted into law. I'm going to defer to Terry, who is pretty well more versed in that area than I am, most likely, or I feel he is, because he is, for the last 3 years, has been working through that with different presidents and different boards. So, but we have talked about several different areas of that would be workable, but it would be obviously time-consuming and very security labored for law enforcement, and particularly the sheriff of the county.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think fundamentally, if there was a way, and we don't have the answer to that, because when the sheriffs begin talking about cultivation, it's really, honestly, very difficult to go very, very far in the conversation. Mm-hmm. They are so adamantly opposed to the legalization in general of marijuana, which that is not the purpose of the discussion, and we realize that. But they do see an extension from anything that we do in this state on the medical cannabis side, legitimate side, if you will, to that full legalization. So it's hard to have much of a conversation because it is a little bit down the road. If there was some way, though, I think the sheriffs would be somewhat comfortable if there was some way, if we're going to grow marijuana in this state for medical reasons, to sort of use some sort of semblance of FDA standards. How the FDA approves drugs in general, how do they manufacture drugs in states and then actually allow that drug to be manipulated to the point it's available to the public. That would be one thought. We don't know what those are. We will certainly, if this body recommends a cultivation model in terms in the form of legislation, we certainly want to be part of that discussion. So we don't know what that is from the legislative perspective. One thing that was discussed in previous years was some sort of oversight. Now, it doesn't seem that anybody, this is a hot potato, it doesn't seem that anybody wants to have the responsibility for oversight. But there certainly needs to be, if there is this, in fact, this phenomenon that we're going forward in our state, or policy that we're going to cultivate marijuana, there's going to have to be some oversight. The state's going to have to in some way do that. And I can say that the sheriffs will want a seat at the table in terms of making those decisions, how that is to be regulated, and they will want some pretty, that they will want the ability to go in and look at these sites and to have access to records at these sites, and have implemented some state regulations on inventory control, waste control, who works there, all sorts of those issues that, you know, haven't even been identified to us. But you all know, you all are familiar with your sheriff. There's one in every county. By law, it's the chief law enforcement officer of the county. There's, as I said, 159 of them, and I mean, we're not going to probably have cultivation in 159 counties, but in those counties that you do have it, that sheriff is going to want to be involved in some sort of oversight. Doesn't mean that that sheriff is ever going to buy into the notion we ought to do this, and his opinion might be to the contrary. But at the same time, if that is in fact the policy, as Sheriff Wilson said, the sheriffs are going to comply and abide by state policy, and we're going to do the best. They're going to do the best they can to participate in whatever role the General Assembly and Governor suggests.
Okay. Somebody popped on there, but was Director Keenan?
Yes, sir. And I wanted to help answer that question.
Okay.
About if it is going to be the policy of the state of Georgia that we're to provide, there will be provided access for medical cannabis, then two ways that the access will be done. Either the state will be doing production and distribution, or they will license private companies to do the production and distribution.
That's correct.
Correct. Okay. Now, there's already standards in place from the Drug Enforcement Administration that regulates pharmaceutical companies, and those regulations give the elements for restrictions and the way to do business for production, for distribution, for transportation, and for security of all those areas. That's in place for pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing hydrocodone, oxycodone, all those drugs. It would be my position with the GBI that why would we deviate from those DEA regulations that are already in place and have the enforcement tools? The problem, of course, is the DEA is not going to have anything to do with this.
Right. But you think we could mirror the regulations?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. And get ready, because they are pulled them. Mm-hmm. They're very comprehensive.
Right. Okay.
And would be expensive and time consuming. But if you're going to provide access, then it needs to be done. It needs to be done through existing processes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Director Keaton. Any other questions for? Yes, Mr. Allen. What number are you down there? 28. Okay.
I agree with Director Keenan and the sheriff. Essentially, and what we do, part of what we do is what Director Keenan said. We go out and monitor things like that. And I'm afraid I've read that crew. And the way we see it, you would almost have to keep up with every seed that was planted to be able to, because one seed is just as illegal as 1,000 seed. That's the way I understand it. I don't want to overstep my bounds with the district attorney sitting there. But it could be done exactly like Director Keenan is saying. Mm-hmm. It could be monitored. The people have to meet certain standards. Make sure none is going out the back door, which is going to be prone. If they're going to do it up in Walker County, you know, they're going to try to take it out the back door just as well as if you take it down to Putnam County and Sheriff Seals gets a hold of it. So, yeah, Georgia Drugs and Narcotics would support exactly what Director Keenan is talking about and what the sheriff's saying. It would need to be controlled.
We're going to actually, one of the presenters today is Cody Stifler, who's going to tell us about the seed-to-sale security system that is being used in other states, and so we'll hear a little bit about that too. Let's see, Senator Miller.
I just want to mention that what Rick Allen and Terry Norris and Chuck Spahos and Vernon Keenan and others have said are accurate and to the point and correct. And it's going to be seed, if there is it has to be, every seed has to be accounted for. Just like as someone used the example with manufacturing pharmaceuticals. But nobody said this was going to be easy. Nobody said this was going to be easy when we started out. And I think that we need to bear in mind that we would not be at the position we're in, we would not have made what I believe to be progress that we have made without Rick Allen and Terry Norris and Chuck Spahos and Vernon Keenan and their willingness to listen and the Sheriff's Association willingness to listen and putting the well-being of those who are medically fragile ahead of their own beliefs and opinions. I don't think there's anybody in this room that I know of personally, I certainly did not, even conceive or consider the path of recreational or delivery systems revolving vaping or smoking. So I just want to say thank you to those that have gotten involved, and we continue to move forward. So,
Mr. Chairman, can I say one last thing?
Mm-hmm, sure.
And what Senator Miller just said.
We'll grab that microphone, make sure we can get you.
What Senator Miller just said, I think, is the reason from the sheriff's perspective that more wasn't said in opposition, because we do feel like we've got people in the General Assembly that that we trust, and you have said it many times, Alan Peake, if I may call you my friend Alan Peake, yes, that you will never support the legalization of marijuana for recreational, social types of purposes.
That's correct.
And that is, I think that one point makes, Senator, thank you, makes the sheriffs feel somewhat better, and makes the, there's a little bit of trust there with y'all, between the two groups.
A little bit? There must be a great deal, and we appreciate it.
We're going to remind you that when I get stopped, we're going 90 miles an hour, we're going home here today through Walker County. Let's see, we got one or more, let's see, Mr. Rignan.
Thank you. Quick comment. The point I wanted to make for everybody who's watching and for everybody who's on the commission, Chairman Peake hit on something a while ago. I think it's important as we move forward for everybody to understand. Chairman Peake had asked about where we anecdotally see an increase in DUIs after the legalization of the oil, and I think the answer to that is no. And the point that I want everybody in the audience and the folks watching to understand, it's probably easy to sit out there and say, they're so cautious, they're so paranoid, it's because of the difference in perspectives. The folks who need this for their children are not the people that we worry about. Responsible users are not the people that the sheriffs worry about. We've spent our careers not seeing those good cases. What we've spent our careers doing is seeing the worst case. I've never prosecuted someone who was sitting at home smoking marijuana and not getting it on the highway. I've had this debate before where people say, would you really want to prosecute someone who didn't drive, who stayed home? And my answer has always been, I haven't had that case. It's because of the traffic fatalities and what we see. You may think, well, those are low, but if you see 1 or 2 a year or 3 a year, it's more than you ever want to see. And so my point is just being that this is a great discussion. Just keep in mind that's where we come from. That's where we come from. If you prevent one, it's the law of unintended consequences. There's a methadone clinic in my jurisdiction, and there are a lot of people who get methadone legally, but that also resulted in a lot of issues for us in the Mountain Circuit with folks getting methadone illegally. So it's not the law-abiding people that we worry about at all. It's not the families that this was designed for that we worry about. It's the folks who would, the unintended consequences, if that makes sense. And I just think that's an important point. This is sort of a day of public safety that to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree, Mr. Rickman. I mean, you guys, the DAs, sheriffs, are already dealing with folks who are high on pharmaceutical drugs, and so, we don't want to add an extra burden to you. I do want to ask before you walk out, we've had, we're looking at making a recommendation to the governor and to the General Assembly in a scenario that we've looked at. It's in other states where there is a limited number, say, of licensees. Let's just pick a number, less than 10, that are given a license to seed to sell. They're able to grow it, process it, and distribute it. Does it make a difference for you and your job to keep that number limited? If all you've got to do is go inspect 10 locations across the state, and you know those 10 locations are the only ones that can grow medical cannabis legally in Georgia, and anybody else you're going to arrest, does that help alleviate some of the concerns that you might have?
Well, I think the opinion of most sheriffs is that the more you limit it is the more that there is a propensity for corruption within that organization, within that company. On the flip side of that, I certainly would be open. I do not know the model you're talking about, but I would think, I know, for speaking for myself, would want to look at a model of another state, maybe that has experienced a limited number of grows, if that's the direction that the state was wanting to go in. However, it's the mindset of most law enforcement now that when you limit that number to 5, I know we've talked about 5 in some of our brief meetings that we've had, is that you're going to have 5 multimillionaires in the state dispensing marijuana. And that's what I think concerns the sheriffs that I've talked with, is that there's a monopoly on that grow, and you've got 5 companies, 5 individuals becoming wealthy dispensing this.
Or they may lose their shirt if nobody's buying it.
Well,
so,
that's true. If no one, I would think someone's going to buy, but certainly I would be open, and I think other sheriffs, I can't speak for the others without talking to them, but we would certainly be open to looking at a model that may have worked with a limited number of approved growers. But again, I echo what Mr. Keenan said earlier. I think there's a model already out there that the DEA has used. I would encourage the committee to look at that and review that, and even though it may be very cumbersome and voluminous, you may still want to look at it and go in a direction, if that is proven for the feds to be the right way to go. I certainly would want to encourage you to take a look at that. But that is our concern with the limit. You would think, well, you'd be open, or we would be more open to 3, 4, 5 people growing in a controlled, licensed environment. But that is the concern we have with just picking. How would you pick those people? And what would be the
that's a fair question.
The application process?
Sure.
Who would approve it? What agency would approve it?
Sure.
And those types of things are the concerns.
And the good news is, in some respects, we have a model already. We have limited number of distributors for alcohol that are, there's a limited number of liquor licenses that you can. So there's a bigger model that already does that, and I understand that concern for corruption. I think in the proper infrastructure that you could limit the potential for that if possible. We're going to hear from the pharmacist later on today too, so it'll be interesting to see whether they agree with your perspective that we, and Director Keenan, that we use that same type of model. But thank you for being here. We appreciate you taking the time away from Walker County citizens, and glad to have you here. Next up, we have Sean Jones, who is the Assistant Police Chief for the Atlanta Police Department. Sean, are you here? I have not had a chance to meet him. Sean Jones, are you here? Okay, we'll continue to move forward, and if he shows up and anybody knows him, just tell him to raise his hand when he gets here so I know. Let's move on to hearing from the Pharmacy Association. We have 3 folks here today. So if you'll come up, Tommy Whitworth, who's the president of the Georgia Pharmacists Association, a pharmacist from LaGrange, Kevin Florence, who's a pharmacist from Athens, and Greg Raybold, if I'm pronouncing you right, VP of Public Policy for the Georgia Pharmacy Association. We're glad to have you all here, and we've enjoyed having Dr. Reese as part of our commission, and so we'll look forward to. And hey, Dr. Whitmore, glad to have you here. Okay, appreciate you coming. So let's see. Mr. Florence, you going to go first, or who's okay?
I was just going to do a short introduction.
Mr. Whitworth, okay, all right.
Yes, sir. First of all, we'd like to thank the Commission for the opportunity and its fine work it's done, and Chairman Peak in particular for the work that you've done, the time, effort, and energy you've done this. Also, a special thanks goes out to two of our fellow colleagues, which are pharmacists on y'all's commission, Dr. Mandy Reese, who is with PCOM School of Pharmacy, the newest School of Pharmacy, state of Georgia, and also Dr. Rick Allen, who is the Commissioner of Director of the Georgia Drugs and Narcotics. Now, of course, neither he or I have a doctor in front of our name officially, but we've been at it long enough they call us doctor. We are honored to be here today and appreciate the opportunity for our thoughts and perspectives on patient care in connection with the use of cannabis oil for medical purposes. Brought along today, Kevin Florence, who is going to be presenting in the event that you have any questions following his presentation. Myself, our Public Policy Lead Director, Greg Raybo, and Kevin will try to answer that. If we don't know the answer, we'll ask Rick or Mandy to answer it for us. But we also stand ready to work with the Commission in any way possible as the Commission works on this important issue. We thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Florence, you want to take it over from here?
Thank you, Tommy, for your introduction. For allowing us to, thank you to the Commissioner and Chairman, allowing us to come and present to y'all today. We hope that we'll be able to give you some information you'll be able to use as you make these decisions and look at where to go with this process. And also want to thank the legislators, too, for taking the time to really look into the issue, look at all the different aspects that all these people have talked about, and make sure we get, if we do decide that it's a process or a process for dispensing or sale, that we do it correctly, that benefits the patients and limits the risk. Let's see here. First and foremost, just want to mention that the role of pharmacists in general is protection of the patient's health and safety. That's our primary focus. It's what we do every day. And there's several different processes we go through every time a prescription is dispensed to make sure that that requirement is met. Anytime we're dealing with dangerous drugs, which are anything that requires a prescription, we're looking at what's it indicated for? Is there a reason to use that? Is there a medical reason that it's needed? And also any reasons that you wouldn't want to use it, something that's contraindicated, be it another medication, a potential adverse effect, or an interaction with that particular disease. We want to make sure that there's a reason for that patient to be on that prescription or that drug or that regimen, and make sure that it's safe for that patient. Things like, if you're on a blood thinner for a heart medicine, then you understand not to take an aspirin for your pain or to find something else that might work. There's simple things like that. And we are always looking at making sure that the patient's taken care of. And in regards to cannabis oil, and specifically, y'all are all aware of the federal schedule and the limit that places on actual studies and reliable kind of guidelines and things. We know there's information out there, but a lot of times it's harder to decipher what it's from and from the products and consistencies. And so things like the dosage form that's used, whether it's smoking or oil or other forms, can vary in these studies and in use. Also the formulations they use and the dosing regimen, they're all different in any of these things. We're going to look at a couple of them. A couple of studies for some synthetic things really quickly. I know y'all have gotten a lot of clinical information, and then just touch on why we think that's important and end with a policy statement. But in light of all that, it just kind of highlights the need for an increased awareness of potential interactions with other drugs. These people that are approved for possession of cannabis oil have serious medical conditions that need treatment. And from a pharmacist perspective, we just want to make sure that everybody is safe and that everything is used properly, and they understand what they're taking and why, and what to look out for. Real quickly, one of the studies we looked at was a review of several different studies to try to find any correlations or common adverse events or drug interactions, in particularly as it relates to pharmacies. And one of these studies looked at 31 other studies that were done and found a fair amount of adverse events reported, most of them being related to actions on the central nervous system, things like dizziness, nausea, things like that we've seen in an earlier presentation. He talked about psychomotor effects, so I won't rehash that. The main thing that is important to remember is that there's potential adverse events with any drug, but that's by no means an attempt to undermine its effectiveness or a reason for use, but it's only to kind of make sure we understand the risk and benefits of each drug. And every day a doctor writes a prescription, they weigh those, and then the pharmacist is charged with just helping the patient understand what they're getting and why they're getting it and what the patient should be looking for. One of the available products in particular is dronabinol. Obviously, that's a synthetic form of active cannabinoid that's available orally. We mention it here because it's FDA approved. That means it's gone through all the rigorous testing and processes to determine whether it's safe and effective and won't cause harm. It's kind of the closest thing we have in the States to look at right now with adequate information. Listed there are some of the possible side effects on mood and memory and sensory perception, definitely dosage related, as I mentioned before. There wasn't any real great contraindications for particular diseases or disease states, just mainly hypersensitivity. And once again, we understand there is a difference between that and the oil. We'll look at another product in a minute. But these are some of the drug-to-drug interactions that were found when they were researching dronabinol, and that deal with the way it's metabolized, the way it has its effects on the body. Some of the interesting ones there are the things like opioids or muscle relaxants or CNS depressants, central nervous system depressants, and also antidepressants or things that deal with mood and with mental issues, and though there's a lot of variations on those. And they can have effects on more than just the central nervous system. You see effects on heart rate and pulse and blood pressure, things like that are more than just altered mental status. And we use this as an example for an FDA-approved drug. There is another drug available in other countries that is more closely related to the CBD oil that I believe this legislation deals with. That's a product called Sativix. It's made by GW Pharmaceuticals. In Great Britain, it's available in other countries. It's a CBD oil that's extracted directly from cannabis sativa leaves, so it comes from the plant. It does have a THC component to it. But in researching that product, they were able to kind of get some more insight into the oil in particular and the effects it has on the body. Some of the adverse effects that were common were, again, those in the central nervous system, like dizziness, fatigue, disorientation, changes in mood and memory, and then even some more, what I would say, more serious things like hallucinations and suicidal thoughts and delusions. They did come up in those studies that then they were looking at that drug and trying to figure out what to be aware of. They did find that it would be contraindicated, which means not recommended for or should not be used in somebody that has family history of schizophrenia or a suspected history, along with other psychotic illnesses or personality disorders, which are kind of hard to determine and very vague in themselves. And also pregnancy warnings and issues. There's always issues with that. It is excreted in the breast milk and can be transferred to a fetus. So those are some of the reasons you wouldn't want to take it. And then as it relates to particular drugs in general, most of them have to do with the way the drug's metabolized in the body. It uses a very common pathway called the CYP450, which is how it does that is not real important, but it's important to know that there's a lot of drugs that are eliminated from the body in that pathway. And so there's a greater potential for interaction with a lot of the common drugs people take for other conditions. And as we mentioned before, these conditions that were approved for CBD oil possession oftentimes have other drugs they're taking, and many of these drugs that use this pathway are eliminated. What happens in that case is both drugs compete for elimination. When one drug gets left active in the body longer, it's dependent on those two drugs that are competing, but you get more of an effect from an individual dose of a drug than you would without multiple drugs present. Part of the some of the drugs that use that pathway that are particularly interesting are the antidepressants or antipsychotics like your Prozac or Zoloft or even Haldol or Risperdal that are used to treat mental conditions, as we've already seen pose an issue there. And also some of the pain medicines like the opioids, oxycodone or tramadol, also use this pathway, and that just means it's going to be less predictable the effect a single dose is going to give. That just kind of reiterates some of the indications for more research or more information given to the patient so that they understand these changes and what could happen, what are the risks should any of these be combined, and the dosage gets properly managed and the patient's aware should any negative side effects come up so they can stop treatment of a particular drug. And like we said, the main thing is making sure the patient understands that all the risks and benefits, and they know when it's an appropriate time to seek other medical counsel. We say all that to kind of highlight some of the issues with different drugs, and that all of these issues do fall within the practice of pharmacy as defined by the state of Georgia. Things like interpreting and evaluating prescription drug orders and making sure they're in the patient's best interest. The state gives us some guidance about what some of the duties they are, including more than just handing out pills, but educating the patients and making sure that we review their medication history and they have an understanding and the doctors have an understanding of what all they're on. Some of those charges in general are information gathering, just collecting patients' health information across all healthcare practices. And it's important to know what that primary condition is being treated, as well as other chronic conditions or other conditions that may have an effect on how that particular treatment is carried out. Making sure that we're aware of any allergies. Anytime you start a new drug, there's a potential for an allergy. And then there are plant and natural product allergies that are out there that are not drug related as well. And also looking at any non-prescription medications a patient might be taking and making sure that those don't have any negative potential with taking those. Another important part of that is taking all this information, like we said, and looking at that particular regimen to make sure that it's appropriate for that patient. And collecting all this data to look at disease indications, contraindications. Is it being prescribed at the right amount? Is it being prescribed at a proper dose? And obviously all these things are based off of guidelines that we have that have been developed, which in this particular case are harder to come by. And once we do all this, we take this data collected, and there's reporting methods, for instance, like adverse reactions, drug allergies to particular components, and these even ways to identify potential epidemic outbreaks like a flu outbreak or something that's prevalent this time of year, so that we can take that data and not only protect the patient but protect the public health in general too. They've mentioned many of the things before about how law enforcement and DEA and stuff use all of these things. A lot of that data is collected at the pharmacy level, and so we do kind of have some other roles there, and we want to be able to provide those that information as well in any kind of medical treatment that's being seen. And all of these things get combined with patient feedback, which is most important to make sure that the patients are not put at further risk with anything that any kind of treatment they're given. And then obviously the main thing we do, and that's most important to myself, is talking to our patients, making sure we understand what their condition is, how they're feeling, what they're doing. Pharmacists are probably the easily accessible healthcare professional at the lowest cost, which is essentially free, because they can walk in any pharmacy anytime and get some medical advice. The number of questions we get on different issues range daily from, I had this negative reaction, should I stop taking this and call the doctor? Is it a major problem? To, can you look at this on my arm and see if I need to go get it treated and check this out? And so we're constantly interacting with our patients. We see many people 2 to 3 times a week, if not month, and so we're really trying to build that relationship and understand why they're being treated, what they're being treated for, and make sure that their full medical regimens don't interact and don't cause any potential harms. And also looking and making sure that they understand what they're getting. They know what to look for when they start a new drug that might, any kind of issues that may show that that drug's having an effect that wasn't intended. Is it causing them to be really dizzy and have a fall risk when they stand up because it's a blood pressure medicine that's lowering their blood pressure and decreasing their circulation? Is it, is it something that has a potential to interact with another drug, or did they understand the goals of their treatment, and are they engaged enough to actually get the benefit of that, making sure the patient understands the importance of properly taking their drugs and staying on them, and really working with them to help them get the best outcome possible. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit about what the Georgia Pharmacy has discussed in relation to cannabis oil. But it's important to note that we do not make or set laws, and we're not advocating for or against any particular sale or distribution of cannabis oil, just merely to be able to be a part of the conversation and make sure that the patients of Georgia are able to get the best care possible, and that they have full access to all the healthcare professionals and all the resources that any patient with any traditional medication would have, and that they get the full scope of practice. And there's obviously a greater need for more healthcare interaction with a new product, a new treatment option as it comes out, to make sure we're looking at all the risk and benefits, and that treatment's really working, and that we're able to properly provide care for those patients. And then there's obviously some other pharmacy practice issues with the way federal law is written in the Schedule 1 of federal law, outside of the research for the drug and how it's used. There's individual license that could be put at risk with pharmacy involvement. There's organizational licenses, business licenses, and also a lot of third-party contractors contracts say you have to operate within the law, and that could be put at risk with potentially dealing with a Schedule 1 drug or in Georgia, as well as at the federal level. But it's still important to be involved in that conversation and look at the best way to make sure the patients are taken care of. In particular, we had this incident come up where a pharmacist at a hospital had admitted a patient who came into the hospital here recently, and they were legally registered with the CBD oil registry, had legal possession of some CBD oil. When they were admitted to the hospital, that hospital pharmacist could not take that medication in and didn't have a way to incorporate it into their treatment, because they were not able to possess it, to keep it, and really didn't have any kind of idea how to proceed. Obviously, he doesn't want to interfere with a patient's treatment, but he doesn't want to put himself or the hospital at risk by dealing with a Schedule 1 substance. So there's a need for kind of hashing out those laws and being able to provide that care without putting the practice at risk.
Ms. Florence, let me stop you there and just ask you a question. I'm not sure how much you had left, but
just a couple more.
Because what your comment there, and I'll ask this maybe Mr. Allen as well too, Dr. Allen, you may can chime in. That's a crucial point. If I understand what you're saying, is that pharmacists want to be involved because it's the practice of what you do, providing input to patients regarding pharmaceuticals that they take, but make sure I understand clear, and Dr. Reese, maybe you could help too, but under current federal law, if we passed legislation in Georgia that will allow the distribution of medical cannabis oil, you would be precluded from being involved as a distribution point by federal law. Is that not correct?
Correct. That federal law prevents distribution of a Schedule I substance.
So even if we wanted to, in our best intentions, and even if the Pharmacists Association wanted to be involved in a distribution model or infrastructure, there really would not be an ability to do that, or pharmacists like yourself would risk loss of your license. Is that correct?
Chairman,
Yeah, that's correct. Because of their DEA license, DEA could take sanctions against them, remove their license, and fine them. That doesn't have anything to do with criminal. As the case he was talking about, a hospital, as it stands now, a patient can come in with their oil, but they would have to retain possession of it or have it as a bedside medicine. There's a clause in the rules that would allow a patient to keep their medicine. Theoretically, the pharmacist is supposed to identify it. They got no way to identify it other than what's on the label.
And I guess this is why you have seen across the country, to the best of my knowledge, there is not a state that goes through a pharmaceutical distribution point for medical cannabis at this point. Is that, I believe that's correct.
That's correct.
Yep. You want to?
I'll chime in here. Connecticut pharmacists are involved in dispensing in Connecticut, but they've done some action on the state level. I'm not advising Georgia to do this, but Connecticut has moved the cannabis from a Schedule I to a Schedule II in their state. So.
And so that limited the exposure for a pharmacist.
Technically, but that's probably not good necessarily grounds to be on because the federal law does trump that. But I think if we could let Mr. Florence finish the presentation.
I'll touch on this next slide, and then a lot of those questions are relevant. Basically, after several months, the year of kind of looking at other states and looking at this policy of how can we still participate and be involved in the discussion to determine the best way to proceed. How can we still be involved in the discussion but not put ourselves at risk? We developed a policy that basically says if and when the law provides for the sale of cannabis oil for medical purpose, any entity licensed to sell cannabis oil for medical purposes should utilize the services of a pharmacist in some way, however that could be worked out, with the main focus on keeping it a medical treatment, a medical reason for using the cannabis, and then therefore allowing them to have those the same services a traditional prescription would have. Obviously understanding the limitations that's provided by that. In regards to other states, she touched on Connecticut. This was largely influenced by what was done in Minnesota, where they said their law reads that any employee that distributes cannabis oil or medical marijuana should have a pharmacist on staff to consult with a patient. The pharmacist doesn't own the product or dispense the product. They don't own the business, but the patient has access to their knowledge and expertise, and they interact with them at that level. That would kind of involves pharmacists, but it's not to the extent that Connecticut did with moving it to a Schedule II. So that's where we were on that. We feel like there's a role, but there's so many barriers, as y'all are seeing, that it's important to just continue to have the discussion and look at different ways things are done, and that with the main cause being protecting the patient safety, maintaining public health and safety, and really being able to offer the level of care to anybody who receives legal doctor-recommended therapy in Georgia.
Okay, so, let me push you on that a little bit, Dr. Reese. I'm jumping here too. Help me with the practical application of that. So if there was an infrastructure in Georgia where there was a distribution point that was non-pharmaceutical, if that makes sense, a retail distribution point, so your recommendation would be that a pharmacist would be involved in that retail distribution point, not dispensing it,
right,
but in providing counseling to the patient.
Yes, counseling, doing on the proper dosage form, follow-up consultations, and assessment. Now, in Florida, one of our previous presenters from a couple of months ago presented on their particular business, which uses the cannabis for more topical products. And what they do is they have a pharmacist that they employ at each of their retail centers. That pharmacist does not technically operate under their pharmacist license, but they have to have the schooling or whatnot, and they're able to serve as a consultant type of role for their business, and they do that in Florida. So I would say from a legal standpoint, the pharmacist, I would personally, and the affiliate association would support this, is having a pharmacist that's employed or that's on a consultant basis with that company that patients can talk to for consulting purposes, patient counseling, assessment, and monitoring. Because I believe, I would think this group would support that we're going to probably be closely watching some monitoring parameters and things like that with this whole arena. And so I think the pharmacist fits into there. So whether they would operate truly under their pharmacist license, or we would say they'd have to have a degree, it's sort of the technicalities of, from a legal standpoint, it's hard to say, but supporting the pharmacist would be, I think that's the takeaway.
Okay. Director Allen, you got any concerns about that, or does that work?
You got me. Well, one, Connecticut issues its own controlled substance license. That's how they were able to get around that.
Okay.
They still have a DEA permit, but I think there's a happy medium there that Connecticut says, well, we're going to make it a Schedule 2, and we're going to do this, and it's not going to cross state lines, and the DEA said, okay. As far as...
Wait, let me stop there. Is that something that you think could be done in Georgia?
Oh, yeah, but we don't have one of those. We could have one of those. Our law is, our Controlled Substance Act was written the same as everybody else's back in the 70s. But we just never took a step forward to create our own permit.
And is that a process that takes years to happen?
No, it just be the law's there. It's there now that we can do that. It just, you have to go that step further to create. I mean, every state around us.
But that step, does that involve federal approval, or
No.
Okay, so it's really just a matter of the will of the General Assembly.
Most of the states in this country have their own controlled substance laws.
Okay.
Georgia, for whatever reason, Georgia does not.
Okay.
It would take specialized training, like she said, because I know, I'm not going to call you Dr. Whitworth. I'm a doctor in 3 states, just not Georgia. When we went to school, our professor didn't teach us anything about marijuana, and I don't know what they do today, but it would take some specialized training to learn about it. Another thing that concerns me is if the patients are going to one doctor to get their cannabis card, what about their GP or their other doctors? Are they even aware of that? So they could be getting their cannabis oil from one doctor, and the pharmacist is going to counsel them. Do they know who their other physicians are? The pharmacist has those records in the pharmacy, most of the time.
Right.
If you all go to, say, it used to be Tommy's store.
Right.
Go
Rick
ahead.
is exactly right. One of the issues that I see is, you're talking about a limited distribution that what we talked about the previous speakers. Now, if I have a child from LaGrange, Georgia, that goes to one of these centers and gets and has dispensed the cannabis oil and is given the proper instructions from a pharmacist that is employed by that limited distributor, it is incumbent upon him or her to find out who the primary pharmacist is back home, so that I know that this patient is identified with that. Then I'm going to be incumbent upon me to learn as much about that as possible, so when that child or that individual goes to a dentist, has a procedure done, or goes to another healthcare provider in my town, then we can form that triage where I can get on the phone and call up the the distribution pharmacist and say, hey, been to the dentist, they gave them a Zithromax and they want to do this and this and this. Tell me what to do. I think this is what I should do. But it's going to take a lot of communication, and we're going to have to re-educate and retool all the pharmacists involved.
Okay. Senator Miller, let me real quick. I think Senator Miller had a question.
Just real quick from Dr. Allen. The states around us, what are they? You started down that road and got distracted there. He's easily distracted, apparently. Don't be texting and driving, Dr. Allen. You started down the path of telling us what other states around us were doing with, and we got in another direction. Do you remember that a second ago? Yes, sir.
No, the Controlled Substance Act, give you a history lesson, back in 1970. And to be just frank about it, the other states saw it as a revenue stream. And they created a revenue stream. You get your pharmacy license, you get your DEA license, and then you get a state controlled substance license. Alabama makes you get each pharmacist get a license as well as the pharmacist, so they all have 4 licenses. So Georgia, just looking after the public, never went down that road.
Okay.
For whatever reason.
But the states around us have gone down.
Yeah, everybody around us has that.
Interesting. Thank you.
Dr. Wetmore, chime in?
Yeah, thank you for the conversation. So I would argue also that we already do that kind of communication already in pediatrics. For example, any of my children that are on chemotherapy, the pharmacist always calls to check. They always ask me, is it okay to take this drug with that drug? And we routinely do this for any complicated child with a medical condition. I also think that we do know quite a bit about cannabis, cannabidiol, and THC. We know about the metabolism. We know it's metabolized by CYP3A, and we know what other drugs are. So we know quite a lot about it, and I don't think that it would require that extensive of education because it's a substance just like any other substance that's metabolized by CYP3A. And not that it's completely without regard to care, but we already communicate regularly among pharmacists, nursing staff, physicians, home providers, because most of our children that come to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta do have home providers, and we send a letter after we care for the child with the discharge medications and recommendations, and they have our contact information so that they can contact us to provide good care.
I think that's the point of the policy that GPHA came to was we understand there's a lot that goes into this, and we want to be able to offer our services and offer our expertise, but it's going to have to be within the whole system, and there's obviously some limits to what we can do, but it's all about making sure that everybody's able to communicate with each other to get that patient the best care.
Which is what we already do.
Right.
And we have to be very careful about opioids. And I think that one would have to think of any of these controlled substances as a drug, as a compound that we need to take carefully and consider. It doesn't necessarily require a class of its own. It's not some mystery hocus pocus thing. It's really quite metabolized by a normal system.
But I think, and that is very true. I think, but the federal legislation keeps it as a C1, which creates all these extra barriers, in a sense, to it. And I think that that's what he's trying to point to.
Okay.
Yeah, and we do mention in the policy that a lot of that would be easier where the schedule changed, but like we said, we don't have any control over that, and we don't advocate for or against that. We just want to be able to work within the system that the state decides to set up.
And what I'm hearing is you want to be involved, clearly, and from Director Allen, they can be involved. You know, there's no preclusion to doing that by current law, and so maybe we're looking at the Pharmacist Employment Act by the medical cannabis legislation in Georgia, but it's key to have the pharmacy organization of pharmacists involved in this process, and so I think it's important for us to make sure that you are included in that process. So.
We just thank you for the opportunity to present, and we hope that y'all are able to get some value of that, and good luck in your discussions. Look forward to seeing what you
Thank you, Kevin. We appreciate it. Any other comments? You want to wrap up?
No, I'll be brief.
Sure.
I do think that what this policy is designed to do is to make sure that patients don't suffer because of the current federal scheme. And so the question is, how can patients continue to get the care that they need without implicating the practice of pharmacy. And so what this policy does, again, we looked closely at Minnesota, and Minnesota has a similar policy. And in whoever is licensed to sell cannabis oil, if they're required to employ a pharmacist, because it's not operating outside of a pharmacy, the pharmacy DEA license aren't going to be implicated, and then the provider and healthcare plan contracts aren't going to be implicated as well. So we think under the current federal scheme, what this does is it preserves the best interest of the patient and creating the least amount of liability for the pharmacies themselves.
And while providing the knowledge of a pharmacist in the transaction.
That's absolutely, absolutely right.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you. Any other questions from the members of the commission? Good testimony. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate the good work you do all over Georgia, too. We got two more presenters, folks, so hang in there with us. Mr. Sean Jones, did I see you come in the room? He is not? Okay. Cody Stifler. I think Cody is here. I saw him. Come on up here. Cody is Regional Vice President for Government Affairs for BioTrack THC. Cody and I have had several conversations about the product that he has. Let me be real clear to the members of this commission. Mr. Stifler is a potential vendor for the state of Georgia. Is that fair? And so he will be pitching a product that would potentially be used in Georgia, and so he clearly does have a motive to support your product, so we want to be clear about that. But it is also a product that has, in my experience, has been used extensively in other states to deal with some of the issues that have been brought up by law enforcement officials already. So, Mr. Stifler, we'll let you speak your piece.
I appreciate that introduction there, Representative Peak. I'd first like to thank the Commission for allowing me the opportunity to testify here before you today. I've worked closely with your counterparts in other states, and I know what they go through, especially with regard to medical cannabis. So for that, your efforts are greatly appreciated. BioTrack THC is a software firm based out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've been serving the legal cannabis industry for over 6 years, making us one of the oldest and most experienced technology companies in this space. Our guiding principles are simple. Build robust software that brings transparency and therefore accountability to the cannabis product lifecycle for patients and authorized businesses. To make sure that cannabis gets into the hands for those whom it is intended and stays out of the hands for those whom it is not intended. To make sure that legitimate businesses have the tools to be successful and those whom are not legitimate are quickly filtered out of the industry. We have two software solutions that are actively used today, both specifically created to enforce regulations and track cannabis product. The first is our private sector commercial inventory management system. This system is actively used by over 1,400 authorized marijuana grow sites and dispensaries to run their businesses while keeping employees accountable and maintaining proper record keeping. The commercial system is being used in all 23 states and abroad, including DC, Canada, South America, and beta testing in 2 universities in Jamaica. Our second software platform is a government monitoring system that collects all the seed to sale data from the commercial application and places it in one spot for government officials and law enforcement to access in real time. So they have access to cannabis production, testing, transportation, destruction, and sales data, empowering these governments with real-time visibility over every plant and every fraction of a gram of authorized cannabis in its production life cycle throughout the entire state. We have emerged as the successful vendor for 4 recent government contracts: Washington State, New York, New Mexico, and Illinois. The Washington State system is a battle-tested system, having successfully tracked over 1.2 million registered plants and over $100 million in taxes due to the state in its first 18 months. It is currently tracking $60 million in cannabis transactions per month and is on pace to track over $1 billion in the next 12 months. Last week, we implemented the New Mexico's medical cannabis tracking system statewide successfully, and this week we are on track launching the state of Illinois' medical cannabis tracking system. As of today, and I want to say this with a very important statement, BioTrack THC stands alone as the only cannabis technology company that has successfully deployed cannabis technology to not only the private sector, but also the government sector. Excuse me. The private sector experience is the most important because of the hands-on knowledge gained from providing commercial seed-to-sale solutions, which is critical to designing an informed government tracking system. This ensures that the government solution is informed by industry best practices, challenges, and relevant innovations, rather than being developed in an uninformed bubble. As I'm certain many of you may know, the U.S. Department of Justice released a memorandum in August of 2013. And that memo indicates that a strong state tracking system is key to satisfying their guidance. And I don't mean to be cliche, but I will be quoting an excerpt from the Cole Memorandum for understanding. And I quote, "In jurisdictions that have enacted laws legalizing marijuana in some form, and that have also implemented strong and effective regulatory and enforcement systems to control the cultivation, distribution, sale, and possession of marijuana, conduct in compliance with those laws and regulation is less likely to threaten the federal priorities set forth. Indeed, a robust system may affirmatively address those priorities set forth by and, for example, implementing effective measures to prevent diversion of marijuana outside of the regulated system and to other states, prohibiting access to marijuana by minors, and replacing illicit marijuana trade that funds criminal enterprises with a tightly regulated market in which revenues are tracked and accounted for." The memorandum goes on to say that if state enforcement efforts are not significantly robust to protect against those harms set forth, the federal government may seek to challenge the regulatory structure itself, in addition to continuing to bring individual enforcement actions, including criminal prosecutions, focused on those harms. Our primary concern at BioTrack THC is the long-term viability of this industry globally. For cannabis to succeed, patients need to have the peace of mind in knowing that products that they purchase are safe for consumption. Business owners who no longer wish to be perceived as barely legal drug dealers require ways to show themselves to be credible businesses with legitimate products. And government agencies need to have the tools to effectively do their jobs in monitoring the industry actively and collecting taxes and enforcing those laws. It's in everyone's best interest, regardless of how you personally feel about cannabis, to preventing the shutting down of this industry by providing comfort to both federal agencies and concerned citizens, and that state authorized products are not being diverted onto the black market, and that black market product is not being inverted into a regulated system. That medicine being purchased has in fact passed laboratory testing and is safe for consumption, and there needs to be a unified platform that allows for easy collection of marijuana production and sales data to create a healthy cannabis environment. Government cannabis tracking systems like the one that has been implemented in the state of Washington are incredibly effective tools. Every plant and every fraction of a gram is visible to the state in real time. All marijuana can be forward traced from seed to sale and can be backwards traced from sale to seed, creating a chain of supply. Wholesale product cannot be shipped without a standardized and electronically filed shipping manifest to the department. And the system blocks the generation of these manifests if the product either fails laboratory testing or has no laboratory results associated with it. If a law enforcement officer pulls over a vehicle transporting cannabis, he or she can refer to the manifest to verify that it is a legitimate transport. If suspicious of the manifest itself, the law enforcement officer can then contact the department and compare the physical document in hand to that of the original digital manifest that was created in the system. I can go on and on about the value of having digital data submitted directly to the state in real time, or how enabling the state to be proactive in ensuring compliance while holding cultivators and dispensaries transparent and therefore accountable is important. But that's not why we're here today. It's because of ill individuals who need the medicine that cannot gain proper access and legal access to it. It's about family members who wish to return to their homes here in the great state of Georgia and live the quality of life that they've been promised by the Constitution. It's about ensuring that we can provide a regulated, safe, and effective market for individuals who need this medicine in some form or another. Medical cannabis is a reality here in Georgia, and there is no question any longer. The question is no longer, am I for cannabis or against it? But the question is now, do we stick to the status quo, or do we put together a strong foundation for a healthy and well-run industry? I think we're all in agreement that the status quo is not a tenable solution, and it's my hope that Georgia will continue to build its reputation and be another example to the on-the-fencers around the country that healthy and successful cannabis industries are a possibility. I thank you for your time, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stifler. Am I pronouncing your last name right, Stifler?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for being here. I've got a couple questions. I'll get us started. So I want to just make sure we understand. You were pretty clear in your presentation, but if your software is enacted or another competitor's software, there is ability to track each individual plant from the moment it's put in the ground to the moment it's given to an individual.
Absolutely.
For every single...
Every plant, every clone, every edible, every pre-rolled joint in states where that is legal. For the recreational markets and for the medical markets, we are able to track every product that is derived from cannabis plants. We are able to track the waste as well.
How about, I know we've had, in fact, Director Allen brought it up, and I know the law enforcement guys have questioned waste. You know, how do we make sure that stuff isn't going out the back door and going to the black market?
In the state of Washington, they implemented a law that requires a 72-hour waiting period in a destruction event. So anytime you're in our system and you go to destroy material that is already listed in the system with a barcode or a unique identifier, that must be quarantined for a 72-hour time period to allow law enforcement to come and investigate and oversee the destruction of that material.
Okay.
And the system does not allow, I apologize,
no.
The system does not allow you to remove that material. It does have a 72-hour countdown instilled with that product.
Okay. And is, to your knowledge, is this type of security tracking required by law in other states that have medical cannabis legislation? Or are there any states that, or I guess, are there any states that do require this type of tracking?
With the state of Washington, they did not require licensees to use, and when I say licensees, I'm talking about marijuana establishments, anybody who cultivates, processes, or retail sales. They were not required to use an electronic tracking system. However, in the state of New York, they did mandate, because of the amount of licensees that they had was so few, that they all used one unified system, so there were no errors in communication of data, and so that it was a streamlined process.
And that's your product that they're using in New York?
Yeah.
Okay.
As I said before, we are the only ones who offer the commercial software as well as the government software, and it has been successfully deployed in many states.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Remind me what number. Press that. 26. Got it.
I have a question. So how do you track every seed, and then each seed is going to grow into a plant of a different size, and so what if you have a plant with 20 leaves compared to a plant with 10 leaves? How do you track that?
Well, between strict security systems that are implemented in the laws for these different facilities, we use a barcode system.
On a seed?
Yes. Well, it's in the actual planter itself. The seed is in the planter. We also account for a harvesting method that a lot of cultivators use, whereas they cut 8 inches off the top of a plant and allow the bottom portion of the plant to continue growing. So the top portion of the plant, that product receives a separate barcode that is linked to the original barcode and to the original mother plant, to the original seed. But again, as I said, with the controls that we have inside the system, we allow for peripheral equipment as well for biometric scanning. So if an employee has possession of one plant and moves it from a seedling room to a cultivation room, that is tracked throughout the whole process. I do urge the state of Georgia, when doing your regulations, to put on security measures that allow for video camera systems, as far as tracking the employees as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Law enforcement guys, yeah, I'm curious what y'all think about this. You know what?
thank you for being with us here. You're familiar with the DEA requirements that go to pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing controlled substances. Are you familiar with those?
I have not read the thickness of that document, but I can answer certain questions. Yes.
Okay. Well, this is one of the things that concerns me as a law enforcement officer. We talk about medical cannabis being a drug, but then we step outside other drug regulations as far as manufacturing, security, transportation, distribution. So we're either, my view, we're either medical marijuana is a medical drug or it isn't. And if it is a drug, let's treat it as close as we can to the way the other requirements that are in place for scheduled drugs.
Yes, sir. I would absolutely agree with that statement. Our system, as I said, tracks from seed to sale, so once it reaches the patient. These transport manifests are created in the system in real time, so the cultivator will create a transport manifest to say this is going to this dispensary. It will list the barcodes specific to those products that are being transported, the vehicle identification information, color, make, model, VIN. The employee who's going to be also driving that vehicle will be identified on the transport manifest. They are uniform manifests. Law enforcement has been trained to identify these manifests and know what they are in the state of Washington. That is the model that they decided to go with. Obviously, other states are looking at the option of using armored car services with armed guards to transport product, as well as the monies that are allocated from the sale of cannabis. So it's dependent upon the state as far as what regulations they would like to implement. But our system is an out-of-the-box system that has the ability to be tailored to specific regulations that you put forth.
Director Keenan, if I may ask, in a scenario that we may be potentially looking at, does requiring a security measure like this give comfort, or is it something that should be required in a potential legislation that we would look at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's security measures for the production of hydrocodone and other controlled substances that are mandated on the manufacturer, on the security they have in place at the manufacturing place, at the place of manufacture, the distributing train that goes out, the train of moving out the product, and then the distribution of the product.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In my view, my position is, if we're going to say cannabis oil is a medical drug, then it's treated like a scheduled medical drug.
And require a security measure such as this.
That are already mandated.
Right, got it. Okay. Thank you.
And Representative Peake, I just wanted to add one more thing to that. With regard to chain of supply and recall orders, our system was able to identify a recall in the cannabis industry not too long ago on the West Coast. There was a manufacturer that created infused soda pops that had a level of THC in them in some form or another. That wasn't actually what we were recalling. However, we did track the amount of THC that went into those bottles. The production of the bottle itself was overcarbonated, and these glass bottles were exploding, creating a hazard. Our system was updated by the state, and they put a stop sale on every single soda bottle that was created in that batch, and we were able to track it because of the THC that was infused with those bottles that were produced. We were able to do in real time stop sale on all those products. So when a retailer used the barcode and scanned into the system, it popped up with an error message that says, do not sell this item, it is on recall. And it was effective. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Director Allen, you have a question?
Well, yeah, one question, and then what Director Keenan says is so true. But with hydrocodone and all the other drugs, DEA puts a quota on how much of that can be produced a year, which I don't know if that's within the purview of this committee or the legislature. But help me understand, you're talking about the plants as you grow it. When it gets to the manufacturer, the person who's going to produce it, are you talking about you track it to them, or do you track it after how much they use to produce?
It is tracked all the way through the production phase. Even sugar leaves, stems, materials that are left over from the drying and curing phases, if they're not destroyed and used for an extract, that can be traced over to the extraction process, and then that oil is associated with a barcode from the extraction point. So in Washington, there are licensees who are also not only cultivators, but they're also producer-processors is what we call them. And they are able to do extraction on site.
So your producers, your growers, so to speak,
Absolutely.
are producers as well?
Right.
Or is our law that says manufacturers?
That is correct.
So are there outside manufacturers?
There are. In other states, they have various states have different laws. As I said, it's all up to the state of Georgia and how they want to form this. We have a team of our government affairs team here is always available to give you any answers to any of your questions as far as laws that have been enacted in other states. I have some documentation here also that goes into detail and it specifies key highlights of the software and its capability. But as far as the extraction is concerned, yes, we do track the oil as well with an associated barcode. And again, that can be done to the mother plant.
So in other words, we kind of get to the heart of it. So you're, whether it's a vertically integrated system where one licensee has seed to sell, or a multi-level 3-tier type system that we have in the liquor system, you can track it no matter what. Is that
Absolutely.
No matter what the format we would set up? Is that what you're trying to get to?
Yeah, and that opens another question that we're not just about the pharmaceutical purity of what they're making.
Yeah.
And if you have the opportunity as well, I urge you to go to the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board's website. They actually have chosen to make sure that all the data that their state system allocates is available to the public in real time. So you can see their sales data, you can see every interaction of cannabis transactions that have occurred in the state since inception.
Sorry. Yeah.
I know. So if person A is growing, I don't know, what was the final? Is it 5% or 10%?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If they're growing that, then that's how much they got to account for, that much plant material.
That's correct. As I said, all the peripheral equipment is integrated into the system, so there's no human error as far as entry of data. So, for instance, we have large weight scales that will cover the amount of waste that is left over. So if that waste automatically gets another barcode and is set for destruction, it would be placed in a quarantine facility, inside the facility, a quarantine room, and that 72-hour destruction period would start. Law enforcement or the overseeing agency could then come and verify that that is destruction material, this is the barcode, this is where it came from, and then view that destruction itself. And the state has the option to, go ahead.
And even if in a vertically integrated or a multi-level type model, if the product was sent to a lab test to test for purity to make sure that, per Director Allen, that it's below 5% THC or is free from molds and pesticides and so forth, even in a scenario like that, it's tracked through that process to the lab, back
Yes.
to the whole process.
A sample is taken from a batch or a lot of marijuana grown inside of a cultivator site. Before it can be moved to an extraction or to a retail dispensary, they have to go through a laboratory testing process. All of our laboratory testing facilities that are licensed by the state of Washington are listed in a drop-down menu in the system. So the cultivator knows that they are dealing with a licensed facility from the state, and that also allows them to see from a choice of different laboratory testing facilities. Now what this also does is once the sample is actually sent using another manifest as well, even just a 5-gram sample of 200 pounds of marijuana from a batch, that sample is then sent to the laboratory testing facility. The laboratory tests that are required by the state of Washington are few. It's up to the state of Georgia how many they want to implement, but those laboratory test results are then entered by the laboratory testing facility, not by the cultivator.
Right, so there's some independence, right?
The student doesn't grade their own paper.
Right, sure, right.
Once the laboratory test results are in, if they have failed, they are no longer able to use that marijuana. Now, in some form, if it was mold or mildew, that floured material can actually still be used as an extract. In some cases, it would not be able to be used. It would be set for destruction. But the system prevents them from being able to move it further through the life cycle if it does fail the laboratory testing.
Okay. Senator Adler, is that you? Question?
I just had a couple questions that I think maybe Director Keenan can answer my question. We're creating a new infrastructure, and what he's proposing is the private sector. And you have a regulatory arm. So there's an infusion, and it's not like on other contracts that the state has with private sector. It's just that this private sector is, like you say, it's like being with the pharmaceutical with very highly controlled substances, even more so than alcohol. So I guess my question is, when you're deciding what type of infrastructure you want, I would personally want a more highly regulated what do you suggest? I mean, what do you see? And I think it would be good for the committee to have different choices of this integrated system, of different choices to make, because it's so sophisticated and it's very difficult to imagine in your mind. But I was just wondering if from the regulatory side, if you had seen other infrastructures.
Well, my position as GBI director would be that the state itself should not be in the business of growing, manufacturing, distributing cannabis oil. The state should be in the business of regulating this. An example I would use, the federal government does not manufacture pharmaceuticals. But they have the DEA and the Food and Drug Administration that highly regulate those private businesses that do that.
But isn't this a completely different set of infrastructure? Because this is the private sector that's now coming in. Where does that fit in to? You're basically taking out the DEA and the FDA?
Yeah. I mean, if the federal law changed, the DEA would, the manufacturing of marijuana would fall under the existing framework that they have. So what the state of Georgia, the only option, the viable option I see for the state of Georgia, if we're going down this road, is to create that regulatory process, which we don't have now, and replicate what the DEA does with the other pharmaceuticals.
So is it adequate? I mean, is it okay to substitute? I mean, you would have to substitute the private sector into that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the private sector is the one that's going to be mandated to follow the regulations that the state sets up.
Right. Okay.
And then the state would be responsible for monitoring compliance with those regulations.
Right.
And this is what I'm seeing with this product. This would be one of the ways that you would monitor the regulations that the state has implemented.
Right.
I would like to add that our system.
Hang on one second, Cody.
I just have one more question for him.
I want to piggyback off that question a little bit though, and put you on the spot, because I think I think we as a commission, we as the legislators in particular, desperately want to know input from you and other law enforcement, particularly you as the GBI director. You know, what is the best model? Do you have a recommendation for? In a scenario where private enterprise is given licenses to do that, and therefore we are setting up a regulatory structure, what agency would be best suited to regulate this new industry? Would it be Department of Revenue, Department of Public Health, Drugs and Narcotics? I mean, have you got a recommendation? I'd love to have your input on that while we're putting you on the spot.
Well, the regulations at the federal level are done by the Drug Enforcement Administration. And the Food and Drug Administration has a role in that also. So if we follow the federal guidelines, it would fall to a law enforcement if that's what this state wants. I'm not advocating that we go beyond where we're at now.
I understand, but in a scenario where there was licenses that need to be regulated, in your opinion, what would be the best agency?
If we're going to attach criminal penalties to failure to follow those regulations, and we're going to license with criminal penalties, then following the federal model, it would be Georgia Bureau of Investigation, if that's the will of the state.
Okay.
It could be other agencies. I mean, but you're asking me what I'm thinking now.
That's what I mentioned. And Senator Adams, you had another question,
Yes,
and I think Mr. Stifler had a response as well too. We'll give you a chance in a second.
What's the name of your company? I didn't catch it.
Our name of our company is Biotech Medical Software Incorporated.
Biotech.
Biotech Medical Software.
And
we are a DBA, and the software that we use currently in the cannabis sector is under BioTrack THC.
So where are you based?
Fort Lauderdale.
Fort Lauderdale?
Yes, ma'am.
And what do you call your segment of the software industry? You call it biomedical? Is that what you call it? Is that the software?
We're in seed to sale tracking.
But I mean, what?
We're
when you look
biomedical software, yes.
Biomedical.
Yeah. We originally started our software platform 10 years ago to combat the pill mill crisis in South Florida. We initially created a system that uses biometric e-prescribing in order to track and trace every single C2 prescription throughout the state.
Uh-huh.
And then when we saw there was a market for the cannabis industry and a lot of states had already created their own PDMP systems, we kind of pivoted to the marijuana industry and based this system off of that same process. Our process has been SAS 70 certified. We also have had an API certification. I'm not sure if anybody here is techie about it, familiar with what an API is, but it's a application program interface. And that allows our state system to communicate with other vendors who have commercial software in this sector. So, if there are other,
how many, who are your competitors? How many competitors do you
there are
think?
various competitors on the market for seed-to-sale tracking systems. You have
How many do you
Brilliant
think?
Sciences. There could be anywhere about 20 of them actually applied for a RFP to the state of Washington. There's
So you're not the only one out there?
No, of course
Okay,
not.
yeah.
No.
We're the only one who has deployed systems to the commercial and government sector.
How many contracts do you have with other states?
We have 4 government contracts currently. We are working in discussions with other states and countries
What
as
states do you have?
well. We have Washington, the state of New Mexico, Illinois, and New York. I'm sorry.
New York?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And New York actually decided to do one whole unified platform where they used our commercial software and our state tracking software together. And the reason they did that was because they used, as Georgia is looking to do, a limited amount of licenses.
I see you've got handouts. Is all that in your
Yes, ma'am.
handouts?
There's plenty of information here. There's also screenshots that actually give you a first-hand look at the system itself. I didn't realize I would have enough time to do a PowerPoint as well as my testimony, so I wanted to make sure you guys left with that information.
We'll make sure the commission members get that. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
You good?
That's it.
You good? Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Stifler? We appreciate your input. Thank you for making the effort to get up here. Yeah. To the members of the commission, let's wrap up. I would like to give an opportunity to Senator Onderman and Representative Dempsey and Senator Miller when they come back. From my colleagues, any comments that you guys would like to make for today? Representative Dempsey.
I'll just say thank you again for continuing to put so much information in front of us. I know this is going to be a very difficult process, but it sounds like we're getting some excellent testimony.
Yeah, it sounds like we are. Yep, Senator Underman, you got
Schedule.
Yep.
What are we planning
Let's
on?
chat about that for a second.
Yeah.
The plan is to, right now, tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, December 1st, would be our final hearing. It'll be an all-day gathering. I would anticipate testimony from 9 to 12 from some final folks we'll have brought in, maybe some public testimony possibly, and then have lunch and then gather as a full commission to have some good roundtable discussion of what we've learned so far and what direction we want to go as far as making a recommendation, if we can come up with a unanimous recommendation. If not, the best we can come up with. I'm open to suggestions on that. If you got some ideas of other ways to do that, I'm sure willing to chat about it.
I was just wondering, who were you having to testify? I mean, what else do we need to hear from?
Well, I know we've had Dee Dawkins Hagler from the Black Caucus has requested to testify in front of the commission, and so we're going to give her an opportunity to do that. We're going to have the executive director of the Sickle Cell Foundation who wanted to testify. We're going to give them an opportunity to do that. We may have a little bit more personal testimony from individuals of how the registry has gone so far. And then if anybody else, I think
personally, I'd be interested more in the infrastructure of what we're trying to create.
Okay.
I mean, we've had lots and lots of testimony from individuals from this year already during session. So,
just as far as nuts and bolts of how to say that?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
All this testimony is great to hear from how much it's needed, but I think we've got the message.
Yeah.
We need to get to the infrastructure, and that's why I was asking the director, what direction are we going? We need something on paper, pick and choose from. What do you agree with? What do you don't agree with?
Okay. That's good input.
To me, that would be much more informative than listening to more testimony. I think
Something's-
we need to agree among ourselves what we want to do.
Something similar to maybe looking at what other states have done
Right.
in their model. Okay.
Right,
Yeah.
if you could put that on an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And, like I said, if you could see this different integrated system, you need something to choose from.
Right.
It can't be, just thinking about this.
Yeah.
And I think that will develop a better piece of legislation.
Yeah. I think that's good input, and we'll work toward that effort. What number are you, Ryan? 18?
18. Do we anticipate doing a written report in addition to legislative?
Actually, all that is required by the bill is a written recommendation from the commission. So I don't think we would envision legislation drafted out of it, just a recommendation.
Okay. Who's writing that report?
The Department of Public Health is taking the lead on providing that.
Got it.
And I think Roma here will probably be helping out as well on that as well too. While we got you, Mr. T, you want any input from the governor's office of are we heading in the right direction? Are we getting the information that you think is helpful, will be helpful to the governor? Anything else you'd like to see?
I'd second.
Grab that microphone so we can.
I second Senator Unerman's. I think we've heard plenty on the need and what you can do with it. Kind of more the logistical, how if we were going to go down that path, and that's a big if, at least for my mind. I don't know about everybody else, but how do you logistically do that?
Mm-hmm.
How do other states do it?
Mm-hmm. So maybe the scenario would be to present to the commission, here's 5 or 6 different options for us of models that have been used in other states. But we hash it out, we talk about it, we see which one we like, which one the majority of us likes, and move forward with a recommendation like that. Is that?
Well, can we get it beforehand now?
Yes.
I think it'd be helpful if we had it beforehand and could study it on our own before
Yes.
we come in and really kind of look at.
Well, it seems
these
like
options.
public health is the accountable organization right now, and it seems like they should develop that, do the research on it, and they've already started doing the research on the medical cards.
Right.
So they've already done a lot of studying, and seems like they could present to us. And I know NCSL has done a tremendous amount of work, and all you have to do is tap into that research.
Yep, that's a good suggestion. Well, how about, is that everybody good with that kind of direction? We'll go down that path, and that's what we'll do. If not most of the day, and this on the first, a good bit of the day, we may hear some limited testimony then. If what I'm hearing is we all see there's a need, we all see that our citizens probably desire this. It's a matter of, if we go down this path, what's the best way to set it up?
Just one additional thought is maybe have 1 or 2 families testify who deal with the challenges day in and day out with the oil and getting it, because I think that can provide some insight for us and their experiences maybe in other states. So I just think 1 or 2 families to testify in addition to 5 or 6 proposed sort of infrastructures would be good.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. Is that Mr. Hickman or Sheriff? Nope. Anybody down there? Oh, yeah, Mr. Rickman.
And it may be, one more input, it may be too much given what we have to do, but I would love to we may not have time for live testimony, but if we could get somebody from the regulatory environment in one of these states that might be willing to talk to us either by letter, that could be a sheriff to say, here's what happened, here's how we approached it. That could be the equivalent of Director Keenan in another state. I don't know who that person is, but just someone to say, here's what this state looked like before this, and here's what we look like now. Is that
okay? Yeah,
that would
sure.
be
Sure. If you'll remember, the first gentleman that came, he was from ASA, I believe. He provided some background information. We'll make sure we circulate that again as well to everybody too. That'll kind of refresh everybody's memory on that. But I think that's a good game plan, and that's what we'll do. This is an important challenge ahead of us, and it's not an easy task to come up with a recommendation that both the governor can support and the General Assembly as well too. So I think that's going to be a challenge for us. But it is being done in other states. There are models out there that have worked and have not worked. So I think we've got we can gather some information from that. Any other comments? That's good comments. Senator Miller, I gave my colleagues from the legislature an opportunity. Any thoughts or comments that you had stepped out when we did that? So if any.
I stepped out for a moment, and I didn't hear Senator Underman's comment, but I did hear Mr. Teague's comment, and I agree. How do we go forward? And I think that when you mention 4, 5, 6, that's probably too many options. The agency needs to make a recommendation of how they can manage it and regulate it and tightly control it and give it credibility and provide it opportunity in a way that does not embarrass the state of Georgia. That's the key right there.
Right.
And we're here about this product and how to get it to the consumer.
Well said. Okay, any further comments? If not, we'll adjourn. We'll see you all again on December the 1st. Thank you.